afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Proletarian. I am once again on vacation here in the beautiful North Woods of Maine. You can probably hear any of the half a dozen or so angry chipmunks who are furiously chipping away at me for disturbing their solitude here in the forest. But I have a few minutes and I just want to make a short video which will please some of you who are tend to get a little perturbed at my long-windedness. But today I want to take a quick look at a knife that I've had for a couple of years now. I've had this since my last trip to Russia. So I know some of you are interested in knives and others still are also interested in Russian ephemera. So this will check a couple of those boxes off for you. In the southern Ural Mountains, just on the European side of the line that divides Russia into its European half and its Asian half, nestled in the mountains, there is a small town, city really, called Zlatoust. And Zlatoust, I'm familiar with Zlatoust because it's only about a 40-minute bus ride or so from my wife's city, Mias, which is on the Asian side of the line. And Zlatoust is a really cool, it's a slightly older city, and for many, many years it has been the center of production, at least in that region of Russia, for all sorts of metalworking. They do some really elaborate and beautiful metal engraving. You can buy these gravures that you can hang on the wall with elaborate scenes of birch trees and rivers and young Russian girls with kerchiefs tied around their heads, lots of sort of folk art. But Zlatoust is also Russia's, or at least that region of Russia's, center for knife production. It's sort of the Russian answer to Sheffield, England, or Solingen in Germany. And there are at least 3 or 4 different knife companies still going in Zlatoust. A lot of them produce sort of art knives or sporting knives or camping knives. But there's one company called ZIK or ZIK, which is still producing, or it's reproducing. I'm not sure if this is a reissue or a continuation of a military knife that it produced for the Russian army or for select units of the Russian army during World War II. And this knife is, or was called, the NR40. And of course, as is the case with most military names or acronyms, the N and the R stand for something. 40 obviously stands for the year of introduction of this knife, which was 1940. N it stands for Nosh, which translates very simply into knife. R, on the other hand, is a real tongue twister. That is a Russian word that I am not going to try to pronounce for you without some guidance from my wife. I will put it up down here below. But this word, when you translate it, I run it through a translating program, it translates a couple of different ways. Some translations show the word to mean scout, and oftentimes the NR40 is referred to or translated into English as the scout knife 40. That's not in the Boy Scout sense of the word, but rather the military scout. Other translations of this word come up as spy or intelligence officer. I don't think that's quite right. But lastly, I think the most important or the most accurate translation of this word is reconnaissance, which I guess is pretty much the same as scout in military terms. So you've got scout knife 1940 or reconnaissance knife 1940. I neglected to bring my ruler out here, so I'm going to go off the top of my head. I believe the length of the blade is just under 7 inches. The length of the cutting edge is just over 5 inches. And The overall length of the knife is a little more than 10 inches, if I recall correctly. Those are all fairly close. They might not be exactly right. But as I said, this is a reproduction of an original military knife. Now, the design of the original knife is based on what the Russians call the finka. I think that's sort of a colloquialism, and it basically means the Finnish knife. And they were very fond of the Finnish puukko knife, which is quite similar to this. Finnish puukko knives tend to have a very straight blade, as this does, with a relatively straight cutting edge and a curved section of the cutting edge out here towards the tip. But the Russians modified the design by adding a clip point to the blade. Puukko knives are generally completely straight spined right out to the tip. This was thought to, maybe it does, increase penetrative capabilities, i.e. stabbing, and in a military knife that makes a little bit of sense. But the Russians basically adopted the Finnish knife and adapted it to their own purposes. And what you see here is actually a very Russian sort of design, and specifically as it was adopted by the Russian military, or at least specific units of the Russian military. As you can see, the reproduction, as was the original, is completely painted black. We've got a wooden handle here, or grip. We've got a bent steel guard, a cross guard, which I will go into in a little bit. And we have a wooden scabbard with a brass collar at the top and a brass tip guard. And all of that is painted black. And it came to be known, obviously, or not surprisingly, as the Black Knife. And as a matter of fact, this knife was issued specifically to a Russian tank battalion during World War II. I can't tell you what that actual battalion was, but even the Germans who fought against this Russian tank battalion ended up referring to the tank battalion as the Schwarzmesser battalion, or the Black Knife battalion. So, and you have to admit, that's a pretty good name from a military standpoint. Better to be known as the Black Knife battalion than the, I don't know, Pink Beret battalion or something like that. So the Black Knife, as it came to be known colloquially, or the NR40, was basically exactly like this. With a few exceptions. We've got the ZIK or ZIK logo on one side of the ricasso, and that's fairly similar to the original. I don't want to get any copyright strikes, so I'm not going to put up anybody else's photos of an original ZIK knife, NR40, but you can find them with a simple Google search. But I will put this up here for you to see. And on the other side of the ricasso, we've got sort of a generic Zlatoust logo. This is not a company trademark. This is sort of a trademark that's used, it's a regional trademark that's used by pretty much all of the knife manufacturers in the Zlatoust region. It's got sort of a crest here with a horse's head and a wing, and Zlatoust in Russian there. That did not appear on the original knives. Another big difference between this and the original knives is the fact that this knife has a blade of a certain length and it features a cross guard. Makes it dangerously close to being what the Russian government refers to as cold steel. Cold steel is a sort of legalese term which is used in much the same way that liberal politicians in the United States refer to certain firearms as assault weapons. Once a knife gets a certain number of features and is designated by the Russian government as cold steel, it can no longer be sold to civilians or tourists, for instance. So the knife does have a blade over a certain length. It's got a cross guard, which makes it look very much like a fighting knife. So if it had a blade of, I think, 3 millimeters or greater, it would be classified as cold steel. They want to be able to sell these knives to normal people and tourists. It's sort of a souvenir knife, although it's pretty well constructed, and I've used it a little bit. Certainly would be good enough for camping chores and the like. Probably not the greatest combat knife, but since it is for sale to civilians and tourists, they've kept the blade at under 3 millimeters, and it's just under 3 millimeters. I put a dial caliper on this yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, and I came up with a blade thickness of something like 2.7 millimeters. Now, the real NR40 that was made during World War II didn't have a particularly thick blade. As you probably already know, the Soviet Union was kind of up against it when it came to raw materials. They're a vast landmass with huge natural deposits of things like iron ore, but their production capabilities, which is perfectly understandable, were stressed to the absolute limit during World War II. So everything cost a lot of money, raw materials cost a lot of money, and these blades were never particularly thick to begin with, but the original NR40 was a bit thicker than this. But all in all, this is a pretty good reproduction of the original, and it is made by the original company. I bought this not at the factory. I have bought some knives at knife factories in Zlatoust. I bought this one at a sort of gift shop very near to the factory. I don't know that ZIK has a factory store. Some of the other knife companies, like ZIK NR is a good example, have wonderful stores built right into their factories. I think ZIK is a little bit more of a serious knife company. They don't really specialize in sort of gift sales or tourist sales. So, but I did buy the knife within walking distance of the factory. So that's kind of cool. All in all, it's just an interesting knife. It is sold as a tourist knife, but it seems to be of relatively good construction. It obviously features a rat tail tang. You can see sort of a circular depression here in the pommel of the grip where they poured, I don't know, maybe epoxy resin or polyester resin or something in there to set the tang. This knife would be perfectly good for doing camp chores, you know, cutting up vegetables for the stew pot, or slicing salami, or, you know, cutting rope, opening packages. I wouldn't even doing some shaving to make kindling for the fire. I would not go trying to do the broad range of bushcraft chores. I'm not going to start pounding on this with a piece of firewood to baton firewood. I'm not saying the knife couldn't handle it, but that blade is awfully thin. So, but it's a cool knife if you're interested in Russian history. There are a number of other manufacturers in Zlatoust that are making their own interpretations of the NR40. Some are like this, with a thin blade and a crossguard. Some have a much thicker blade, which is more like the original knife, but without any crossguard at all. These are just the legal hoops that the manufacturers have to jump through to be able to sell these knives to somebody other than a police officer or a soldier, or an official organization that's looking to buy knives. The NR40 continued in limited issue in the Russian military from 1940 up until the early 1960s, I believe. It was replaced by several other knives in more recent years, but it did have a pretty long run. It inspired some copies in other Warsaw Pact countries. The Polish military issued a knife that was very similar to this, which is quite rare and very expensive. They're probably as hard, maybe harder to find than original NR40s, and command similar high price tags. These knives also, the originals, are very expensive. So it's just a cool resource. If you're interested in Russian history, particularly military Russian history, or if one of your hobbies is portraying living history, living military history, and you're portraying a Soviet soldier on the Eastern Front, or even a German soldier on the Eastern Front, remember, captured weapons, knives, and other accoutrements were always popular, even with enemy soldiers. So if you were portraying a German soldier on the Eastern Front, this could be a cool bit of kit to add to your regalia. Oh, I wanted to mention also the cross guard. If you look at this knife, I'll throw up a close-up of it. The cross guard is bent, but it's bent in a very unusual way. You would expect the cross guard to be bent up at the rear for thumb purchase and down at the front of the knife to keep your finger from sliding up onto the blade. This is exactly opposite, and it makes it kind of awkward when you're using this knife as a knife for camp chores. But the reason it was bent like this is not an error, was that, and I know very little about Soviet military knife fighting doctrine, but what I do know is that when they trained soldiers how to use knives for fighting, the knife was held with the blade facing upward and the point forward. So I don't know what purpose that serves. Again, I know absolutely nothing about Soviet military knife fighting techniques, but that's kind of an interesting thing. And most of the other reproductions of the NR40 or Finca from other manufacturers will have a bent cross guard, but it will be bent in the traditional manner, up at the back, down in the front. But this is what the original knife had. And as far as I know, this is the most original reproduction or copy of the original NR40 that's available today. These are available, I mean, you can buy these from Russia through eBay, I think, but you're going to pay quite a bit of money for one of these. And if you're doing a living history interpretation and you really feel like you need this knife, I would say go ahead and buy it. For most of you who are just looking for kind of a cool knife, I'm not sure that this is worth the $100 or so that you're going to pay for one on eBay to get it shipped to you from Russia. I happily paid, I think, $35 for this, or the equivalent in rubles. I'm not sure. I always do the conversion in my head and I remember the American price. I don't remember what the ruble price was, but it was about 35 bucks. And at 35 bucks, I'm very well pleased with this. It's a cool thing, even if you're just going to keep it on your desk as a letter opener or something. Again, it would be cool for military interpretation. If you're traveling to Russia and you can get one for 35 bucks, I think it makes a fun little camp knife. The wooden scabbard is quite robust. It looks to be made, I'm looking inside it, it looks to be made out of birch. One thing about the black paint on these is it is very flaky. There's a bit missing off of the tip guard already. You can see the brass underneath that. There's a little bit of paint flaking off of the butt here. I don't know, I must have banged it into something. But that does seem to be accurate as far as the original knives. When you find an original NR40, or if you Google and look at images of original NR40 knives, most of them will have most of the black paint completely flaked off. The handle will be more or less wood color with just a couple of patches of black around there. So that doesn't really bother me that this is flaking off. The more that it chips and gets banged up, the more authentic it will look. So anyway, I think it's a cool and interesting knife. I hope you found this video interesting. If you did, and you'd like to be kept up to date on what's going on here on the Proletarian, please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. It goes a long way to help me out. Like, share, tell your friends, and when I post new content to the channel, as I hope to do in the very near future, I hope to see each of you here then. Later, guys.